So I'm Patrick O'Rourke, MobileSyrup's Managing Editor, and this right here, this is the S10 Plus, one of the best Android phones you can buy right now. The S10, the S10 Plus, and the new entry-level S10e, and yes, I say that kind of in quotes, also mark the most significant physical change to the Galaxy series since the release of the S7 back in 2016. With that said though, set your expectations appropriately because the same fingerprint and smudge attracting all glass design Samsung has adopted for the last few years is back once again, only with a few notable tweaks this time. So let's get into what's new this year. First, there's the ultrasonic in-display fingerprint sensor. Rather than a photo, the S10's in-display fingerprint sensor uses high-frequency ultrasonic sound to authenticate the user. This means that the S10's fingerprint sensor is more accurate and also works under cold weather conditions, which is definitely a necessity in Canada. In my experience, the S10 and the S10 Plus's in-display fingerprint sensor works well most of the time, though it does fail more than a standard fingerprint sensor. It also took me a little while to build up the muscle memory to remember to place my finger in the exact same location on the S10 every time. Even with those issues in mind, the in-display sensor is way easier to use than the S9 or the S8's strangely placed rear scanner. The other big change this year is the S10's new Infinity O display. Rather than a notch, the S10, the S10 Plus, and the S10e all feature hole punch cutouts for the phone's front-facing shooters. The cutout is crisp, clear, and definitely preferable to a notch as far as I'm concerned. And if you're worried about what apps look like with the Infinity O cutout, most apps seem to just simply scale to fit the S10 screen. Speaking of display, this time around the S10 screen measures in at 6.1 inches with a 1440 by 3040 pixel resolution, while the S10 Plus rocks a 6.4 inch screen that comes in at the same resolution. If you're worried that the S10's circular display cutouts will be distracting, that's not something that you really need to be concerned about because it will just fade into the background of the experience similar to a notch on any other smartphone. Next, there's the S10 series cameras. I won't go into the details surrounding the megapixels and apertures included in the S10's 3-camera array because the phones feature the same 12 megapixel cameras as the S9, right down to last year's variable aperture feature. If you're interested in learning more detail about the phone's cameras, you can always check out my full review on mobilesyrup.com. When it comes to cameras though and what's actually new, the big difference this year is the addition of a 16 megapixel ultra-wide shooter across the entire line, including the S10, the S10 Plus, and the S10e. The ultra-wide camera comes in handy in certain situations, but it also unfortunately distorts images. The overall camera performance across the board of the S10 feels on par with the S9. This means that while photos still look great, they feel slightly overprocessed for my taste. It's also worth noting that the phone lags behind the competition in terms of low light performance, particularly Google's Pixel 3 if you take into account its night sight functionality. Regarding differences between the S10 and the S10 Plus's shooter, the larger version of the phone features a second 8 megapixel RGB depth camera that handles the S10 Plus's live focus lighting effects optically rather than digitally. The difference between the digital and the optical effects is far more dramatic than I expected, with the S10 Plus offering natural-looking depth of field, while the S10e and S10 feature a more processed look. The S10e also features 2 rear cameras instead of 3, the same wide and ultra-wide shooters as the S10 and the S10 Plus. And finally, the S10 series also features a new super steady shooting mode that works really well. All 3 phones feature Qualcomm's Snapdragon 855 processor, coupled with different amounts of RAM depending on storage configuration. 8 gigs of RAM with the S10 and the S10 Plus, while a special ceramic version of the S10 Plus features 12 gigs of RAM. The S10e, on the other hand, comes in at 6 gigs or 8 gigs of RAM, depending on whether you opt for a 128 gig or a 256 gig version of the phone. The phone's performance is solid across the board regardless of which device you choose, whether you're playing games, browsing the internet, or hunting for dank memes on Instagram. Samsung's new One UI is also a cut above every Android skin I've ever used. But as always, I'd still prefer the phone just ran on stock Android, but we all know that's not going to happen with a Samsung device. Beyond just the camera, there are also other differences with the S10e over the S10 and the S10 Plus. The phone's bezels are a little larger, and overall the device feels chunkier. The biggest change is that the S10 features a side fingerprint sensor on the phone's power button, rather than an in-display scanner. The S10e is also still pretty pricey too, as I alluded to earlier, coming in at just a few $100s cheaper than the sleeker looking S10. Across the board, Samsung's S10 series are great devices, even the S10e, the company's answer to the iPhone XR. The phones feature very few faults beyond their expensive price tags and offer some of the best and most consistent performance I've experienced with a smartphone. Similar to all modern flagship smartphones though, you're going to be shelling out a lot of money to get your hands on an S10, even the slightly lesser S10e. So that's it. Thanks a lot for watching. Be sure to check out my more detailed full written review of the S10, the S10 Plus, and the S10e on MobileSyrup.com.